to practicing awakening from the meaning crisis. I'm embodying it fully now. We're practicing awakening from the meaning crisis, cultivating wisdom here. My name is Sarah. I'm here with my friend Lizelle, and we're going to be talking about episode 6, which is covering Aristotle, Kant, and evolution. So to get started, we're going to open up with Plato again. So I'm going to pass it over to Lizelle.
Hello, world. Yes, so I came across this passage, which I thought was very appropriate for me, but also for you, Sarah, and future things maybe. Because I mentioned to you that I did find this one challenging. I do not have your biological background. I've read a couple of books on evolution, but it's not the same as actually having studied it for 5 years. So I have noticed that the philosophical life is getting a bit harder. And then I saw this passage. It's from the 7th letter of Plato, where he's basically asking himself or telling the people to whom he's writing, how can you tell if someone is truly devoted to the philosophical life? So now there is an experimental method for determining the truth in such cases. One must point out to such woman that the whole plan is possible and explain what preliminary steps and how much hard work it will require for the hearer. If she is genuinely devoted to philosophy and is a woman of the divinity, with a natural affinity and fitness for the work, sees in the course marked out a path of enchantment, which she must at once strain every nerve to follow, or die in the attempt. Thereupon, she braces herself and her guide to the task and does not relax her efforts until she either crowns them with final accomplishment or acquires the faculty of tracing her own way, no longer accompanied by the pathfinder. When this conviction has taken possession of her, such a woman passes her life in whatever occupations she may engage in, but through it all never ceases to practice philosophy and such habits of daily life as will be most effective in making her an intelligent and retentive student, able to reason soberly by herself. Other practices than these she shuns to the end. That's the promise of a difficult path for those who pursue philosophy.
Oh, that's so great. Well, sounds like a path I don't mind being on. I like being on it. I like being on it with you.
Yes, likewise.
Yeah.
It's more enjoyable and somehow easier if you have a companion, right? Plus, I think philosophy is philia sophias. I think it's supposed to be this, like sharing with a companion, sharing with a friend, not just practicing on your own.
I agree. Yeah. And we were just mentioning how it's becoming even clearer how this is benefiting us, discussing what we view, because oftentimes when we're watching the podcast or any kind of like anything we're watching it what was the word that you used? Like
passive knowledge. We have a good passive knowledge, but the active knowledge, we're now practicing the active knowledge of these things.
Yeah.
For the first time in my life, I think. Well, I've taught other things, but not philosophy.
Yeah. And so a lot of this has to do with like, okay, now we have to formulate into words what we just heard and reflect that back. And that actually is the difficult part of acquiring the knowledge. Yeah.
Practicing.
Right.
Practicing awakening.
Great name choice, by the way. That was you. So I want to.
No, I think we came up with it together. I think you mentioned something and I was like, hey, yeah, I like the word.
Cultivating wisdom. You were like, he's already got that. So.
Oh, yes.
That was what I had suggested. And then I think you just were like, what about just practicing? I was like, simple enough. I mean, that makes sense. So yeah, even though I couldn't get it out very good today. All right. Well, shall we navigate our way from Plato then, since that's what we were talking about? We were talking about Plato and we were talking about Socrates. And so now we're going to move into Aristotle. So yeah, the route that I had was through form and eidos. What were you going to say?
When I was reviewing this and listening to Aristotle's view of form, I was like, oh, maybe I was completely mystifying forms. Maybe I'm trying to see it too mystically, and I should just come back to Earth, like be more Aristotelian, or how do you say that?
Aristotelian? Is that?
Yes,
I think I've
yes,
heard it like that. Okay.
yes, yeah, that sounds good.
Nice. And well, okay, and that's so you mentioned how you were coming at this with it was a little bit challenging, a little bit more challenging the philosophy like relative. And for me, when I saw this episode, I was like, wow, it clicks because I've been trained in this frame of thinking of evolution. So and so that was where it became clear what John says when he's mentioning that we take for granted, or it's very obvious, this way of thinking. We take it for granted. And I understand what he means now, because you just don't even notice how ingrained it is until something like this comes up where it's a recall of everything that you learned for however long you study a discipline. It's like, oh, you're just going back over everything that I already know, and now I can apply it to something else. So that was how I felt about this episode. I was like super excited to start talking about evolution again. So, and in a peculiar way, it came into my life in other ways too, that I was talking to you about with jobs and stuff. So interesting. But yeah, so the thing about Aristotle and Plato, the difference here is that Aristotle realizes that Plato doesn't account for change. So that's where Aristotle is interested in growth and development, and therefore has this approach that's much more biological based, as opposed to the mathematical approach that was for Plato. And having been, I guess, influenced a lot by Pythagoras too, through Socrates, or him and Socrates having that mathematical kind of influence over Plato, and then Aristotle diverging from that mathematical approach and saying it's more complicated than that. That's kind of what I gathered from it. It's like life's a little bit more messy than just what.
Or maybe he said it's more simple than that. Like,
Yeah.
it's not just all ideas and they're in your, like, up there. It's just look at freaking plants.
Yeah.
It's John mentioned somewhere when he gets to Kant, he said, like, he walked out and saw a tree and he was perplexed. And I was like,
Yeah.
that is a perfect line, right?
Yeah, that was
But that's
great.
basically what Aristotle said. Just walk out and see a tree, and that will transform the way you think of things.
Yeah. Yeah. So this idea of being interested in growth and development relates to form, in that the role of form in growth and development is actuality. This term that he mentioned, it's like, what makes a chair a chair? Is it actualizing its potential? So he like really emphasizes the word actuality here, as it relates to form and structural functional organization. So
yeah, I think the potential and actuality comes in, and he keeps saying, remember, this is an analogy. Human beings, living things, work in the same way, but let's use the analogy of wood. So we have wood, that's the potential.
mm-hmm.
Anything can happen with that wood, but then it is actualized either as a ship or as a chair or as a table or whatever you want to make from the wood. So that is the potential, and indeed it is informed. It's made into a form when it is made into a chair or in a table, and that informed thing. And that is what the form sounds so simple when you put it like that. is then the structural functional organization. And I knew I had to practice saying that because he keeps it's this that's like super important in this episode. Structural functional organization.
Yeah. Yeah, I emphasize that one too. And that idea of giving form. So I like how he said given form. So in formation, it's information. So putting a form into something to actualize its potential there as well. If you inform it, then you actualize its potential.
Yes.
That's really cool.
And it sounds so deep when you say that. It
It
sounds like there must be another level on which that is true as well, right?
That's so
If you
ingrained.
inform
So
something.
information is what causes the okay, and I think always from evolutionary um backdrop, like that's just always what's happening. So when I think about this idea of it's given form, information, it's an informed organism, so it's going to respond to its environment in a particular way based on the information that puts it into formation. So interesting how embedded in our language that concept is. And but when you start to tear apart the word, this is, I think a phenomenon we feel when we're spelling out a word and we spell it slowly, and then we start to like feel like that word isn't spelled right. What? This word starts to look really weird. And that's the sensation that I feel with this kind of epiphany that he's presented with this idea of information providing that structural functional organization.
Because it feels completely different. Information, it's just like we work with information all the time. But information, that's
Oh. Oh. Okay. All right. So we've got words like information, actual, and potential. That one's really like he's like you just don't understand how embedded this is in science. And I instantly did. I instantly, when he started talking about actuality and potentiality and thinking about kinetic and potential energy. So kinetic and potential energy, when something's up here on the mountaintop and it can just fall, and that's the potential energy being released or whatever. It's just like the concepts of science come back when he mentions those words. So,
and not only on a Tuesday at 4 o'clock.
right. That was a fun little one too. When does
I
it
laughed
happen?
so much. I laughed so much, but also things that I don't know if he meant it to be funny. I laughed at. Like, look at me, I'm a living thing. Like,
triangle. And the homunculus. That's a hilarious concept in I don't know if that was like psychology or something, but they have something similar in biology. It's skipping ahead a lot, so I won't go too far into it, but the idea of the homunculus reminded me of this idea that a sperm is like a little tiny human, and it has a very similar name. I should have looked it up, but I didn't. But the image is like the sperm. It's a giant head and a tiny little body, and it's got a little tail. And this is how they used to think that humans grew and developed, was they were this one little sperm is a tiny little human, not the egg and the sperm coming together.
well, it looks like a tadpole, right?
It does look like a tadpole. They thought it did the same thing.
Yeah.
So, which
So,
is, a great observation. And
yeah,
if we're
it's
like
good
looking at,
science,
it's good science.
actually.
Yeah. Checks out until we figure out something different. So, yeah.
The egg is actually also important.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, moving from that structural functional organization being very similar to this idea of eidos and form, and then we're interested in this idea now with Aristotle of change and development. And somebody that builds on that concept is Alicia Yararo with her dynamical systems theory. So she has okay, I guess we're just going to like dig into this, because I don't think that I can summarize unless you want to kind of do that. I don't know. Like
We're not summarizing, we're practicing awakening.
Practicing. Okay. So like my mind with Alicia Uraro really was on how form and eidos is similar to constraints. And so, because she's looking at actuality versus potentiality. And so I really focused on that potentiality part, because it's the causation part was kind of worked out with Newton, and this idea of, you know, things happen because something causes them to happen. And so, yeah, I was really interested in this part, the constraints part, and how we kind of seem to overlook that aspect when we get too scientific, when we get too into that Newtonian approach of cause and effect.
Yes. I think that was also actually a good summary that you just gave.
Oh, funny. What another thing, I mean, just to like relate this with my understanding of kind of like spirituality a little bit too, is like the causes and constraints. It's interesting how that relates with yin and yang, or feminine and masculine. Like the causes, that's a very masculine approach, where constraints, this is the conditions that make things possible. This is possibility, this is potentiality. And it's so interesting how that is a very similar concept to the container within which things happen. This is feminine, yin, and open, receptive. So I thought that was interesting how, oh, it does make sense in a way that we've kind of tried to eliminate that feminine aspect of understanding.
Yeah, with Newton, when things got all super logical and scientific, but in a one track way, and like you mentioned before we started talking, I didn't even see that, like how feminine Aristotle was in his recognizing nature, like nature as the feminine, which was so important to him. It's
yeah. There's also a deeper lesson with Aristotle of training that, training that, and that. Oh, I don't know. I think maybe he'll get more into it when he talks about the worldview. That was kind of the cliffhanger at the end of this episode, was like, okay, now we're going to talk more about Aristotle. So I'm interested to get more into it. But like you're saying, like that connection with nature and recognizing how nurturing is a part of this, how, yeah, just the environment is very much a part of how we grow and develop.
And how, well, evolution happened, right?
Yeah.
Like it was the environment. He mentioned like how 80 something million, I don't know, years there was nothing, because there was no need for, there was no lack in the environment, there was no scarcity of resources, so there just wasn't any evolution. There was no life, just stayed quite chill. And so the environment's, yeah, also there, like
it brings me to that quote, necessity is the mother of invention. It's really interesting too that when I think about that quote, it's mother, you know, so it's recognizing that too, that container is feminine.
I didn't see it that way, but it's a very interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, with evolution, it's all about pressure. It's like, what are you pressured to do? What is causing you to make that decision? So you make a decision, that's inevitable, or you know, you get pushed in a direction if you're an organism that doesn't have the ability to make that decision. You get pushed towards kind of whatever is most beneficial to you, or like what you're going to be able to survive in. There's obviously the risk of making the wrong decision and you can't survive in whatever you've chosen. But yeah, like there's something there that we're able to organize, that we're able to use our environment to advise us which decision is going to, yeah, be adaptable, or how, or I don't know, like adaptable is the process. So
the only book from this episode that I have and read is this one. The others are crazy expensive. Like I would love to have, like Alicia's book, I can't remember her surname, but is not that expensive. It's 50 euros. So but the other one is 150 euros, and that's just too much. I would love to have it, Eric Pearl, but
We'll find a used copy.
I will find a used copy someday or borrow someone's or whatever. I will get to it. But why I mentioned this book is when I was reading it, I was because as I said, I don't know as much about evolution as you do, but they also quite go deep into it and how we see color specifically, but not just how humans see color, but how birds see color and insects see color, and how the environment and the living creature, how everyone kind of co-evolved, and like it's like this dance between the container and the contained, the living thing, which is a self
Right.
self-making
There we
autopay.
go.
Funny,
Yeah.
I didn't actually read the word autopiotic in this book. Maybe
Okay.
they mentioned it somewhere. Maybe I dozed off while I was reading it, because he said it's them. But yeah, but it's just beautiful. It was so beautiful how the dance of life, how everything just.
Oh, I know. I mean, systematics is my favorite part of biology. How it all fits together, taxonomy, phylogeny, the maps, just like genes, genetics. It's all incredible. How it was kind of like my argument when I was so fully invested in just biology and scientific thinking. I would tell people, like, I'm making your God greater by giving him the capacity to do this. The fact that this has happened is bonkers. So, yeah. There cannot be a science called biology, though.
Well, what does Kant know, right?
What
That
does
is.
Kant know? Huh. Wow.
So yeah, that does, because the problem why there can't be a science like biology is because we want to avoid that circular argumentation, right? And the problem is living things do work in a circle. So that's why living things can't be studied according to Kant. And yeah, and then John says, well, maybe we should question Newton, right?
Yeah.
There are other things that we know is not 100%.
Right. Relativity.
Sorry?
Relativity.
Yes. But I mean, for his time, it was awesome. Like, it's just, yeah. I think what we said before we recorded, it's not that it's not truth, it's just not the whole truth.
Right.
Because the cause is part, it's one part of this whole thing, the cause. But there's also the constraints, which we forget if we don't look at Aristotle and only at Newton. But Newton made it easy, like A to B to C. Very, very logical, very, yes, that makes sense. And that we can argue like that. And we don't have to argue in a circle. We don't have to go triangle.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is very important to understand about science, is that it's always intended to be like proving it wrong. You're always intended to be looking at it and questioning it, not accepting it for face value. And another thing about science is, well, the way that you have biology is, in a scientific way, is you control for things. You say, well, based on, if we took away the rain and the conditions stayed like this all the time, then this would happen. Okay, so already you're making a lot of assumptions in that controlled environment that is never going to happen consistently. So by eliminating certain features of the environment, then you can make this cause and effect make sense. Well, isn't that convenient?
Kind of when you take away the constraints part.
Yes, that's exactly what they've done. Yeah, with science, you take away the constraints, and you only, so what happens from that is now you're looking at the average, how things might play out based on the average of how they could play out. But what you've eliminated is the outliers. You've said those don't exist. We're just looking at this part of the graph. Those outliers, they're not okay. Well, they've clearly capitalized on some sort of constraint, those outliers, or they're being, negatively affected by some sort of constraint, but in some way they're different. And we just eliminate those parts. What's worse is that, this becomes an even further problem when you isolate the science that is put on a platform, aka published. So now you only have certain data being published, which is eliminating outliers. Okay, so before we got disconnected, I was saying that in biology, you're controlling for the constraints. So you're removing those. And in that, you're removing the outliers. So you publish work that says, here's the average of what will happen. So this is always going to happen, basically. It's like, trust the science. When there's so many outliers that they didn't even mention, not to even mention all of the papers that don't get published. So several orders of outliers are not being taken into consideration. And we've built our science, around I don't know, just like brief statements of cause and effect. It's like, this happens. Yeah, easy. Moving on. And so that's caused us to take for granted things like the fact that we have blood pumping through our body, and that's fascinating. We constantly breathe, and that's amazing. There's little molecules of oxygen in our blood. So I think that by removing the constraints, we took away the magic, the inspiration.
The wonder. I like wonder. I like wonder, the word wonder. I think it's important that we go deeper into the constraints, and then specifically in the fact that there's two different types, the enabling and the selective.
Yeah, so the enabling, what I gathered is that makes a type of event more possible, and then, so enabling constraints make a type of event more possible, where the selective constraints reduce the number of possibilities that there are.
That's how I got it as well. Because that's really important to evolution, right?
It's very important. In fact, what we can do is, for the purpose
of natural selection, sorry, we should say natural selection and not
natural
just
selection. Yeah.
Evolution.
Because what we can do is say here, genetic variation is is kind of analogous to how this works. So if you think about it, selective constraints, so reduce the number of possibilities that there are. Well, I don't feel like I need to go too much further into making this more biology.
No, so he does. Yeah. The enabling is the fact that there are so many, like you've mentioned before, like there's so many variations. So there's someone is bound to survive.
Okay. Okay. So enabling constraints, you said something is able to evolve because it makes a type of event more possible.
Yeah, because there's a variation, so there's more options, right? That's how I understand it.
Yes. Yep. So because you can even think of, there's like a greater gene pool. There's more variety. There's more things you can pick from.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. And then the selective constraints reduces the number of possibilities that there are. So I think what I'm struggling with is the fact that constraints now is being divided into two different things, and I'm having trouble. And it may have been the disruption there with the internet, but
I think it's the disruption with the internet that we need to come back.
Okay, so because constraints, just so I can lay it out for myself, is conditions that make things possible. There's the potential. So within that potential,
you talk about it as a container earlier. Maybe it will help you to go back to that idea that it's a container.
Yep, the container.
But in the container, there's things that makes it, the water has the ability to shape itself to the container, but in no other way. So that's a limiting constraint, a selective constraint, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But it can be frozen or it can be gas. So that's different possibilities. So
Yep. Yeah, different possibilities for the environment to have an impact, whether they're allowing for things to happen or whether they're constraining in this way where they're causing the organism, for instance, to select something from the reduction or the reduced number of possibilities that they have.
yeah.
So they're being given or or things are being taken away from them, and they have to make decisions based on the environment that presents
Or
itself.
we can use this because he rolls a pen all the time.
Yeah.
So we can use that. Like an enabling constraint for the pen to roll is there's space open in front of it. That's an enabling. A selective constraint would be if there's a hole in the table, then it won't be able to roll past that hole, right?
Yep.
That something like that, I think.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And that kind of leads into Darwin understanding those selective constraints. So with this idea of natural selection, that there are things in the environment that can actually reduce the possibilities.
Yeah.
And those are going to cause the organism to evolve as well, or adapt in some sort of way.
Or die.
Or die. Yes. This also is what he relates to the virtual governor.
That is why I wanted to mention these specifically, because then the virtual governor is the one who limits. So it's the selective constraints, if I get it right, if I think and then the virtual generator is the one who produces options. So that is the enabling constraints, I would think.
Yeah, and the enabling constraint, I have here variation to open up the options.
Yes.
And make that virtual generator. And together they make the virtual engine, the selective constraints and the enabling constraints.
Yes.
Right? Yes. Yeah, okay. And so that was what you were talking about earlier too, with this idea of selective constraints and how that relates with Darwin, where scarcity of resources caused life to evolve because it stopped being this big soup because certain things were less available. If there's that scarcity of resources and competition over the same resources, well, somebody needs to change here. There's not enough room in this town for the two of us if we're eating the same thing anyway. So then life has to be like, all right, well, I'm going to diverge out and try different things then.
Yeah.
And then, okay, cool. So now I'm back. All right. And
so that will be for me exactly then the selective constraints. But the enabling constraints would be what is potential in the organisms already. So in what way are they able to adapt to? Someone needs to change. So like, how are they able to? That will be enabling constraints in my mind.
Yeah. So. Yeah. I mean, just based on the genes that you're born with and what different things those can do. There's like every single whatever, everything that can be read in the transcript of our DNA can have multiple different ways that it comes up based on the conditions that it's put in. So
I have to think now as the internet as both an enabling constraint and a selective constraint, because we've just experienced it. It enables us to be able to communicate, but sometimes your service provider decides to work on your internet without informing you.
Right.
And then,
then they reduce my ability.
Yeah.
They reduce the possibility of this conversation being fluid, at least.
Hey, adapt or die.
Yeah,
we're adaptive.
That's funny because when we were off the call, that was what I texted you was I'm having to deal with this constraint of the internet not working.
Yeah, practicing your wave.
Practicing on and off the air.
So, we live, we learn.
Yeah. Experiential. Gosh.
Yeah.
The lessons, they keep coming up. So we got to that idea of the virtual engine being that kind of exchange between selective constraint and variation. And so changing in a way to better fit to the environment. I wanted to mention that John says that Darwinian theory is beholden to Aristotle. It is also beholden to Thomas Henry Huxley. As a biologist, we have to mention that. Okay. And so just like as a nice brief summary, he says to kind of orient the ship and see where we've been is that Socrates had this overcoming self-deception dilemma. And Plato is going to kind of work with that through this structural theory for how to overcome that self-deception. And Aristotle is interested in the development or that virtual engine that we were just talking about.
The growth and development, indeed. How do things grow?
Yeah. So how does wisdom or meaning develop?
And as John keeps pointing out, it's so, I mean, we talk in these ways. We have no idea. He mentions at a point, we need to deepen these. We need to reanimate these terms again. And it's so true because we talk about it. Oh, I'm working on, are you growth orientated or not? And we have no idea that it comes from Aristotle. It's like, it has such a deep and rich history.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we think it's like, since they had that grit thing, like you have to have grit, like since then everybody's like, oh, I need to grow. But no, it's a pretty deep history that we have to, like I mentioned to you before we started recording, last time we talked about how you should know your engine. But this is, and I'm so happy, I forgot that he mentioned engine. Exactly, that engine is actually, the virtual engine is the actual word. Because yes, 30, 40 years that we've been here has informed our engine a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But my word, like this, even more so. This is our environment. This is the container in which we were born. And this has shaped like us in such a way that we just don't see it anymore. This is the water in which we are the fish that swim. This thing.
Yeah. And that's what I was telling you also before we started recording is that's the sensation that I've gotten out of being around my elders, my grandparents, and even my parents too. But it's just this idea that I'm learning something through them that isn't like a logical learning. It's an experience of their body has been through things. And there's just ways that I can gather information from that about them that is directly important to me, since directly relevant to me. So yeah, there's just, it's in the way they talk, it's in their mannerisms, there's just other things about them. And if you carry that further back, I'm sure like if I got to experience my great 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 grandmother or great 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 grandfather, then I would learn something about them through their body and what they were living in. The conditions that they were living in during their time informs me of how to be adaptable, because I'm reflecting kind of on their, acquisition of knowledge.
Yeah.
That's nuts. That's why these lineages seem so important, and why it feels, we were talking about this before, how it feels so right to be doing this kind of thing where we're preserving this kind of knowledge and trying to continue in it and make it something where we're more conversational about the origins of all the things that we think. That ideas get passed down and then they become the meme, and then they become so intrinsic to our everyday, everything that we do every day, that we don't even notice them anymore. They are no longer something we can consider. And it's interesting how that is kind of the container, that is kind of the constraints, the environment.
I think the first part of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series is John trying to show us like, this is how your machinery was formed. This is why you think what you think. Just take note, like there's a history here. And
yeah, I mean, I plugged immediately. And I did have this moral dilemma, or like this like philosophical dilemma with biology the past couple of years, which I'm kind of coming out of, but it was just that I had been indoctrinated to believe something again, because I had had this experience with religion before. I had been very Christian growing up as a child. I wanted to go to church. I kind of forced my grandparents to take me. I went through catechism with my mom, and And I wanted that philosophical wisdom. I wanted that connection with God. And then I go over and I live in a Middle Eastern country where they're doing prayer call 5 times a day. And I'm like, what? They're doing that? And I'm like kneeling and like doing catechism, but that's nothing compared to every day, 5 times a day. And Ramadan, let's not mention. So yeah, I just like had this philosophical dilemma. And so then I kind of had a philosophical dilemma with biology when I started to explain it to people, because I had read this book. And so I started to explain biology, phylogenetic trees, and I was like, I'm talking about experiments. Everything that I reference is, well, Harold and Crick found this, or, like what whoever found this, and they did this experiment and they found this. And I started to realize that I hadn't performed those experiments myself. I didn't recreate the conditions. They were definitely replicatable. They're replicable experiments that I could do, but I hadn't. So I didn't have that kind of understanding of them. And it just felt like, you know, my, I don't know, it just felt like there was stuff missing. So yeah, there's just, there's gatekeepers in all of the sciences and all of the disciplines, I'm sure. But the gatekeepers in the biology don't allow for the novice scientists to get in. The, you know, the people that are just graduating, it's very difficult to move any further into this whole gatekeeping of publishing and how that whole world works. So it doesn't allow for new ideas to come in, because they're just going to be discredited before they even get published. And if they don't get published, nobody ever sees them and they can't improve them. So that thought just kind of ends up suspended in, Never Never Land, and nobody's ever going to get to it. No scientist is ever going to say, that was an interesting idea. Very wrong. Everything's wrong about that experiment, but I'd like to build on that. It's not even an option. So that's the issue with like publishing and that whole side of the scientific world, even though it's really beneficial and it's necessary to kind of, I don't know, organize it in some sort of way. It's just, it eliminates a lot of variables.
I hear a deeper problem with the academic world in general.
Yeah.
I hear the lack of a mentor-student relationship. Someone older and wiser and more learned that actually is willing to sit with you and listen to your ideas and tell you where you're wrong. And that tiny spot where maybe you could be right.
Yep.
Like, I think that is lacking in the academic world, that mentorship.
Well, and it's because your mentor that you select is going to say a lot about you, and you're going to say a lot about your mentor. So they have to be very selective. I had a great relationship with my first reader on my project, but he actually wasn't a very popular professor. He didn't hang out with the other professors. He was kind of like this oddball that hung out by himself, the microbiology guy that was studying like bacteria and fungus, So it was just that he didn't have connections. So it's like there's so many different problems with that system of, okay, so my professor isn't popular enough to get my paper published. That's really what it ultimately came down to. So yeah, it's weird, that system and how that's set up. But I think that brings me back to what that whole idea of a elder, having a mentor. This is so important for the way that we learn, to be walked through like this.
But maybe that is why John's always saying the academic world is not where you go to find wisdom. It's because for which definitely you need a mentor or teacher.
Yeah. So that was the question here, was how does wisdom or meaning develop? That's the Aristotelian question. And I guess the answer to that is character. Building character.
Cultivating character.
Cultivating character.
I just love that part. I forwarded to a few friends as well. That's the Socratic question part. And the part after that, the name is a crazy, but it's not. I don't know why if YouTube did it, because it's a crazier, but it calls it a crazy, and I was like, it was like,
Are you talking about the auto-populated closed captioning? Yeah.
And
I didn't notice that.
I had to, because I was watching it when I was watching it for the second time in 2 weeks. I watched only 10 minutes at a time, kind of, to be able to absorb it. And I had to stop just before a crazy. And I was like, really? Like, this sounds so interesting.
Crazy.
Yeah, but that the Socratic question part is just amazing. John does not like being called a preacher. He hates it, I think. But I mean, he's he's such a, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
he
This
really
is
gets the message across. Let's just put it like that. With the importance of cultivating character.
Yep. Yep. Okay, because that's, I mean, because he goes into so many different ways to explain it. So this
Mm.
idea of acting out of character, if somebody's acting out of character, it's saying something bad about them. It's saying, oh, he wasn't living up to his potential, or this, yeah, yeah, acting out of character, he says, is an existential or moral criticism of someone.
Yeah. And I love how he brought it back to, because I think this virtual engine thing is, of course, not Aristotle. It was now by the Sadisha woman. But I love how he brought it back, or she brought it back. Like, you can actually actively participate in the further creation of your virtual engine. And that is what cultivating character is, which I think is just beautiful. And yeah.
Yeah. So I have some things written down about that cultivation. So questions, I guess, that he was saying to ask. It's what is the personal engine, and what system of constraints have you identified with, and that regulates your development. So what have you internalized that regulates your development? So there's a lot of questioning here about that personal engine and how to improve that personal engine or add some oil or whatever. Yeah.
And it's an ongoing process. And this living up to your potential thing, living up to your potential, also the way he explains it, so it goes so deep. I used to always hate it when people uh, pointed out that I'm not living up to my potential, because I have a tendency to do that. But it's hard work. It's hard work living up to your potential.
Yeah.
As But yeah, so we can also talk about what it means for Aristotle to live up to your potential, because he has that layers of what a human being is, or what, yeah, because we're different things.
Yeah. So
But
the life, the levels of, I guess, like distinguishing between levels of organization in organisms. So he's talking like at the base level you have, and this is Aristotle's idea, organic, organism, inorganic organism, inorganic things like rocks, stones, whatever. Then you have informed organisms, living things, self-moving things, the mental psyche. So we're rational things with
yeah,
this psyche.
yeah, we already start being part of the whole living things thing. Look at me, I'm a living thing. I'm gonna get it like that. And I wish I was Charles Darwin.
Yeah.
So we already start there, and then he says, like, yeah, people can just be a plant for their life, but then they're not living up to their potential, because human beings have all this, the rest of the potential that they're capable of being. A rock can't be a living thing even. Well, not as we understand it.
Yeah.
And yeah, so we start there at the living thing.
Yeah, a living thing, a moving thing. So was a non-living thing, moving and living and going out and getting energy from food as opposed to absorbing it from the sun. That's the thing about trees. He was like, why do trees spread out? Because yeah, they can't move. I gotta sit here and wait for it to come to me. This is why I have such reverence for trees. My God, they just sit there and wait for decades, centuries, whatever.
And it's amazing how they grow. Like, my parents have quite a number of trees, and garden, and their neighbors as well. So there's been like, they resolved it friendly, but one of the neighbors' trees were like growing into over into my parents' garden, and then my parents' tree were like growing like this. It's like
Uh,
because it had to, you know. So it's like it, it completely stopped growing in that direction because the other tree was there. So it just
yeah.
started growing like this. They're so innovative actually. It's so like they
Yeah,
grow where they can. It's like amazing.
it is.
So
Yeah, that's so amazing. So, but yeah, they can't get too far away. They can at least try to get the sun over here, but for the most part, they can't move. So yeah, they're stuck there. They have to wait for things to happen. But as this and so the movement there is very important because he mentioned psyche again. And with
yes.
psyche, it's that the mind can move itself. And
Mm.
so that is where we're this kind of well, I guess after we push past even mental psyche, we move into the fact that we're rational about it. So I guess we can review the movements that we've made.
Because I think last time we talked about also the difference between us and the rest of creation, and um, the psyche part, like, yeah, animals is also self movement moving, and they're also mental because they also have a brain. They
Mm-hmm.
also can do smart things.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as we know, they're not quite that not they're not they don't have this rationality.
Right.
So then according to this view, uh, to be fully human is to live up to your potential of being as rational as possible. I don't know if I agree with that, as I mentioned to you before, but I am committed to that for as long as we're doing this awakening series, because I do think John is committed to that. And he's really big on rationality.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think going through this series is polishing our rational faculties. I think
Yeah.
that's what we're doing here. And especially when we come to the cognitive science part of the lab. But he keeps throwing cognitive science in as we go along as well. Like his little wisdom, what is wisdom bombs, he also
Yeah.
throws in some. So I do think that's what we're doing here. So even though I'm not completely committed to the fact that being human means to be rational,
Mm-hmm.
I am committed to exploring that.
Me too. Yeah. That's where I'm at too, because there's this trap that we kind of run into with thinking that people that are more rational are more evolved.
Yeah.
And so that gets really tricky when you consider different cultures that don't highly value this idea of logic or rational thought, where it's more about how do we survive in community and how do we come together and ritual. And so, having this big emphasis on just rational thought and not incorporating this embodied way of
Yes,
being.
but that's also something that which which I'm now happy I can share with you, because I know John's work a little better. Rationality is not what we think it is, according to John. Like ritual to him is a part of rationality. I can't remember exactly how I wrote it down, but it is a type of embodied rationality ritual.
Hmm.
It's so to him, the term rationality, and the book that I showed about Plato last time, Plato's critique of impure reason, it feels like that also kind of expands the concept of rationality. John often says, like, we fall into a trap. We think of logic as rationality, but the two
Okay.
are not equal.
Okay.
Um, in fact, Schlender, DC Schlender, the book that I just mentioned, actually equates reason with love, which is quite a move, right?
Mm-hmm.
So also I'm hoping the second time I went through the series, and I feel that now I know nothing. So I don't know that I got a reason. I went exactly again through the series because I was like, what is reason? What is this rationality that we are after? So I'm hoping we will, as we go through it again and discuss it, because it's so much better to discuss it, we will figure out also what is rationality. What exactly is it that we're polishing here?
Yeah. Okay. Because I had written down you have the right beliefs, but not sufficient character.
Yeah.
And somehow I
Oh,
feel like that kind of wraps that rationality part into it a little better than thinking of it just as logic. Being a
yes.
rational person
Oh,
is recognizing your ability to cultivate character.
oh, I see where you're going. It's really good. That really hurt, by the way. Like you have
Yeah.
the
Oh,
right.
I know. He said it to me. He said it to me. I
It's like,
felt
oh
it.
shit. Just
Okay.
after I
That's
had a
fine.
huge bowl of pasta.
Yes,
Just don't have
you're
enough character to say no.
and this is that where that acrasia or a crazy
Yeah.
comes in, because you shouldn't. You have a weak
So it's
will.
crazy, right? To do it anyway. You know you
Right.
shouldn't.
Yeah, I think I should say I think he said that you don't it isn't just simply that you have a weak will, because that whole
No.
idea, the concept of will has been discarded or at least
Yeah, the
debunked.
other book that we talked about, Breakdown of the Will, also goes into that. That last week we talked about.
Okay, okay.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, it's
All
will is
right.
not really a thing.
Um
It's like I know somewhere John also says grit is also not really a thing, and the two feel a little bit connected.
mhm. Yeah. Um, okay, so we went through that whole like organization of um, Aristotle, and I think we also wanted to touch on that idea of, oh, you already said the autopoietic wasn't in that book that you had already pulled up. That was while we were here
Yeah,
recording, right?
yeah.
Okay.
No, I
Um,
think I yeah, we recorded that.
okay, good. Okay. So where did you want to move? We definitely have kind of mentioned what makes humans different, I guess,
Yeah.
of how we are rational things, how we are rational creatures. Um,
I
and
think we covered everything.
connecting the idea of that virtual engine with this idea of virtue is very
Because that's how
interesting.
you cultivate character.
Uh-huh.
Because the virtue is like knowing, because he uses the great example of courage. Like you have this enabling constraints of um, you can do it, but so you just run in the street, which is not really courage. That's foolhardiness.
Yeah.
And you have this selective constraints, which is like you're scared to shit, like you can't do anything. So somewhere the golden mean, not
Mm-hmm.
not not the middle way, but having the right balance between selective and enabling constraints is your what is the engine things, your virtual generator and your virtual governor working well together, type of thing. That's what I get from that's virtue, that
Yeah. Yeah. Because that's the virtual engine.
yeah.
So when we're using that analogy of a virtual engine, it's like virtue is the answer to that. What is it? What is that dynamic between those two elements?
You want a virtuous virtual engine to have a
Yeah.
character that's yeah living
Yeah.
up to your potential.
Living up to your potential. And so the question is like, okay, well, how do you define virtue? Who defines virtue? Yeah.
Well, the
Is that where we're going into worldview? Into Aristotle's worldview
maybe,
next?
but that's kind of like all of Plato.
Okay, yeah.
And
Yeah.
all of these dialectic into to dialogos practices is how do you define virtue?
Okay.
It's
So we've already got virtue defined. Now we are trying to cultivate that virtue that has been
well, we
defined.
do not have it because the what I find, because I referred before to these weekends that John and Chris and Guy have, and oh no, I can't remember her name. Reinhardt is her surname, Corinna. That they have, because I said they should give her more credit, and now I forget her name. So,
Nate, that's even more reason why.
exactly. So you try to you circle around a virtue and you try to define it. you're never really capable of defining it completely. But by this search, you by speaking of it, you also have this mindset. By speaking of it, you already bring it into being in a certain way.
Yep.
So you're already informing yourself about the virtue by trying to define it. So that is a way of character building, just going in search of definitions. It's
Yeah, the curiosity is what's so interesting, is that when you're curious about something, then, well, this idea of it becomes more curious about you, but you just like start to build a relationship with whatever it is that you're exploring, and then you start to embody it in this very shamanic kind of way.
So that is a whole different practice, which is great.
Yeah.
Too.
Okay. Do you have any anything that you wanted to cover here in the end? I know you had Spinoza.
Yes.
Did we cover the purpose of self-making, you think? That whole idea where he kept saying that it was a self-making system. And so with evolution, it's a self-making, self-checking system. And so I think the idea here was that whole virtual engine could also serve that purpose for our development of the mind.
Yeah, we are a self-making thing. And our purpose is to make ourselves, basically. I think that's basically what he says. Yeah. And then to make ourselves beautiful and good and true. If we're gonna, I have to keep speaking.
Nice. Okay, well, I mean,
I do also want to read his wisdom. Another definition that he gives for wisdom is gaining the ability to cultivate virtues, to create your virtual engine, what is regulating your growth and development, so that you actualize your potential and fulfill your purpose. I then want to add. So that idea of taking charge of your destiny, because I think Aristotle also said, or maybe someone, I actually had a quote, but yeah. So it's basically like your habits, your daily habits, it's what forms your character, and your character is what shapes your destiny. And in that sense, you make your own destiny. Of course, there's limiting constraints, selective constraints. We were all born with certain abilities. Things like IQ is not really amendable, where the opportunities we had to be informed culturally is also not amendable. But going forward, we do have ourselves in our own hands to a certain extent.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about Jordan Peterson, about how this whole idea of like, you know, doing the best that you can, or living up to your highest potential. Like that's the idea of making your bed. It's just like, because you can, and you should, so that when you come home, you've got a made bed and you're happy about it. You did that for yourself. So that, I mean, it makes sense how those patterns and those, you know, routines that we get into can change who we are. I'm happy because my bed's made when I get home for me, and I did that. So yeah.
The importance of daily habits is underestimated in society.
Absolutely. The constraints.
But it's not an easy thing. And hence it includes the most famous line of Spinoza. So I'm just going to read. If the way which, as I have shown, leads hither seems very difficult, it can nevertheless be found. It must indeed be difficult, since it is so seldom discovered. For if salvation lay ready to hand and could be discovered without great labor, how could it be possible that it should be neglected almost by everyone? But all noble things are as difficult as they are rare. It's beautiful. And I do want to quote Aristotle. I think it's Aristotle. It's like one of those, don't tell Christopher. I found it on Facebook. Just those quotes. Choice, not chance, determines your destiny. Choice of daily habits, then specifically, I think.
Wow. Yeah. Those are good. Choice, not chance. Wow. I love that episode. I mean, as a biologist, I take a lot from Aristotle, and that frame of thinking has benefited me a lot in being able to kind of organize life. That was what I gleaned most from biology, is that it's Adam's job. I'm naming things, I'm going to put a label on that. That's what that is. That's how it works. Okay, moving on, next organism, and that changes and it shifts, but that's the idea of biology, is let's put labels on everything so that we understand it. So I appreciate coming from a philosophical approach to it now and understanding how that relates with me and my purpose or my finding meaning or whatever life is, from that more ethereal place, I guess, or more spiritual place, the mind.
And I love how the woman who created this theory of the virtual governor, virtual generator, virtual engine is a woman.
Alicia Yolaro.
Not just naming, but actually, dancing with the whole system. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm getting excited. I've been excited since the beginning, but
Yeah.
this was challenging for me, very challenging. It was one of those, I noticed I didn't comment because it was probably one that was a little over my head.
Taking a little more time to brew that. I needed to marinate it in a little longer. Yeah.
But yeah, we're ready to do the work and chase the noble thing.
Yeah. So next we're going to be looking at Aristotle's worldview, apparently, because like I said, that's the cliffhanger. So I'll be interested to explore his thoughts even more, because I really enjoy reading and learning more about Aristotle. So that's what we're coming to in a couple of weeks, and that'll be episode 7. So I think we're ready to close this one out. We will be back very soon, and until then,